I'd like to begin with the readings from the Bible, from St. Matthew's chapter 5. This is a very important and famous and significant section of the Bible. And I'll read this section, which is known as the Beatitudes, because it starts right at the beginning of that chapter. And to set the context, as we remember in the previous discussions, Jesus has been baptized. Jesus has gone up onto the mount and has been tempted, 40 days of fasting, been tempted, come down from where he was in seclusion in the inner silence, gathers his disciples, come, follow me. I will make the fishers of men rather than fishermen of fish. And they follow him. And very early in his ministry, he begins his ministry. Now, very early in the ministry, this is where this begins. So it's right at the beginning. He's basically what he's going to do in these chapters 5, chapter 6, that I'm using from St. Matthew, the gospel. He basically sets out his teachings. And of course, he elaborates on it, and there's many other things to come in the future. But if you were to read a section of the Bible and wondering, what is Christianity all about? Not churchianity. I'm not talking about the religion. I'm talking about the teachings here of Christianity, of what Christ taught. It would be worthwhile for you to read these two chapters at least, chapter 5, chapter 6 of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Now, this is also covered somewhat, but I don't think quite as nicely in the other Gospels as well. But so we're going to cover in this week, I'd like to speak about the Beatitudes, which is this first very small section of these, and also then we'll continue probably next week with additional talking about the rest of what has come to be known as the Sermon on the Mount. And we'll have time. I want to leave time for questions. Now, whether we get to those questions, leave time for questions this week or next week or the week after, I'm not sure. But do compile what questions you have. Now, the interesting thing let me just read this, and then I'll get to it. We'll be speaking about it. This, as I say, St. Matthew chapter 5. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So it's very, very straightforward, not too long. And these, blessed art thou, sayings, as I said, have come down to us as known as the Beatitudes. Now, and then from there, he goes on with a much longer exposition on his teachings themselves. But I want to preface this by making a few points before we'll go into each of these one by one in a little bit more depth. And in this longer, so the Beatitudes and the longer sermons, he's making it very clear about the attitudes that are needed to live a God-centered life. And he was not just giving a code of behavior, but calls upon his followers to live by the spirit that informs any code of behavior. Now, many centuries before Christ, before Jesus, the great prophet Moses had arisen, who was a great master, and he led the children of Israel, the Jewish people, out of bondage in Egypt and led them out of bondage into the Holy Land of what is now in the country of Israel, in that region. And he gave the people that he led, he gave them the 10 commandments, which have come down. But there's much more than the 10 commandments. You can, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet, and so on. It's basically the first 5 books of the Old Testament are known as the Torah, and in there is given the code of conduct of how one should behave and the rules of conduct. Similar, you might say, if you go back into the ancient Vedic tradition, the laws of Manu, how we should behave, what should we do. And in a certain age, when people's understanding is not great, as perhaps later when they come to a deeper understanding, people do, in some eras, need laws. They need definitive statements. You should not do this. You should do that. Look at the yamas and the niyamas. Very simple statements. Nonviolence. You don't lie. Possessiveness, so on. And then, but the human mind and the human nature is always say, yes, but what about this? Because if you draw very definite lines in the sand, so to speak, people will always, but yeah, but how do you apply that in a daily life? And yes, but is the natural reaction of the mind. And we are exhorted by the great saints and the great people that precede us to take these and apply them into our daily life. And that takes intuitive understanding. It takes more than just the mental written word. It takes intuition. It takes something of the heart. And so what you have here is the Jewish people have been handed the rules of conduct by Moses and following the prophets that came after him. And their society had become very rule bound. Well, here this prophet Jesus of Nazareth comes, and he's speaking in a way that in the Sermon on the Mount and in all his teachings, he's exhorting his followers to live by the Spirit that informs moral or spiritual behavior. That yes, but if you go inside, what is the spirit of a rule? And this dynamic exists still today. Is there the letter of the law and the spirit of the law and the spiritual teachings? One must develop that intuitive understanding. And perhaps society up to that point was not capable of doing that. But Jesus came at a time when he was bringing a message that exhorted people to don't be bound by that. The age has come when we need to go deeper into these to understand. And people responded to that. Now we must understand when we read this Sermon on the Mount or we hear it, that Jesus was speaking to his disciples. He wasn't necessarily speaking to the common folk. Seeing the multitudes, as it starts out, we read, he went up into the mountain, and when he said, his disciples came unto him. Now, there were probably many others besides his disciples. Many of the common folk probably also went up there. But sometimes you hear it said, oh, there were thousands surrounding him, and you see him, perhaps dramatizations of this, him sitting there and speaking to the multitudes. Well, in a practical sense, was that even possible? I mean, how far can you project your voice to thousands of people? Modern day, we think of it in terms of our modern capabilities, but in those days, probably not. But he had a group of people around him. His voice carried a certain distance, but it must have been measured in the dozens, perhaps. And these were his disciples. He had gathered his disciples, as the story goes. He had gathered disciples and he brought them. Now he was going to teach them. And as he was said, he's going to make them fishers of men. And so he expounded very, very early in his ministry these you could say, these basic principles. And he was exhorting his followers, particularly his disciples here. He wanted them to live in a different way than other people and hold to a much higher standard of conduct. Because as we'll see as we go through this sermon a little bit, he was holding a high bar. He was setting a high bar, and it was going to be something we would aspire to. And isn't it so even today? Each of us, we aspire to high values, but then we have to bring them down to a level to the best of our ability. But he was, you could say, challenging his disciples to reach up to that. And he had come, you could say, there's a saying in the Bible also, one does not put new wine into old wineskins. And he was basically saying that this is a new expression, and we have to see it as something new. We can't fit it into the old modes. And so he was saying, you are special, and you're going to take this. I think he would be saying to his disciples, you're going to take this out and share this new news. I am, and he also, you have to understand that, as Master said, also, besides the words that he was sharing with them, he also gave them techniques. As he said to Peter, he says, I have given to thee the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And as Master said, those keys to the kingdom of heaven were the techniques. And similar, as Paramhansa Yogananda even said, similar to the techniques that he was sharing and our great Master shared in the tradition of Kriya Yoga. But the basic message, you might say, is God is our Father who sees and cares about the heart, not just the external performance of rituals of religion, but not just caring for the heart, our intentions, but he, as we'll see in these Beatitudes, he was exhorting people to apply those into their daily life. Now, he uses the term for righteousness' sake. And when you see this word righteousness, or when you hear this word righteousness, what that means is like you could equivalency of for Dharma, for the sake of Dharma, the application of a teaching into daily life, bringing these into daily life. And that's when he uses these words for righteousness, those who want to be an instrument for righteousness' sake. And so he asked his disciples, and oftentimes, to set themselves to a higher standard. And oftentimes he would compare that to what was commonly taught. And particularly he poked fun, or used as a foil, you might say, the practices of the scribes and priests of his day. And of course, naturally, he had fun at their expense, you might say, but naturally this fed the hatred of the priesthood and garnered to himself a great deal of criticism, because they were wedded, you might say, to the form. And naturally, that's the case, the form versus the spirit. And so this is the Beatitudes are really meant for those who seek something deeper, soul's relationship with God. I remember I first read these. I was, as I've said numerous times to those who know me, that I wasn't brought up as a Christian. It was in the background, Christian society, but I was not a practicing Christian. Wasn't my family's tradition. And I remember somebody, when I was a sophomore in college, somebody, for whatever reason, I don't remember even who and what, but gave me a little pocket Bible, and which I had a coat, and I put that in kind of in the breast pocket there. And I thought, I want to read that someday. And I had gone home for the holidays, Christmas holidays. I would have been 19 at that time. And on the way from my parents' home, where I was at the Christmas holiday, back to the school where I was going to school, I rode the bus, and it was a couple hour bus ride. And nothing to read. So I started reading it, and I started with the first book, which is the Gospel of St. Matthew of the New Testament. And I read this whole section up through these first chapters, and it struck me. I was very much touched because I had no interest. I knew about Jesus Christ as a historical figure, and it's in the background of my culture, so his name was very familiar, but I'd never studied anything about him other than the basic outline of his life. And I started reading this, and I was very, very touched. And I still remember, I thought, this was a wise man. This was a wise man. And I saw him removing the lens of religiosity or the lens of structural formal religion, which made, I was not attracted to at all. And I saw him just as a person, imagined him. And so as we read these, we imagine him sitting there with on the spot on the mountainside, perhaps, speaking around him, maybe a few dozen people or so, deep disciples. And he was sharing these words: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." Now, blessed are the poor, sometimes you hear that said. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom. But he was not saying that at all. He wasn't exalting just because one is poor in a material sense, somehow the poor shall inherit the world, or theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He was saying those who are poor in spirit. And he did not mean poor-spirited in the sense of having a bad attitude. This is, I think, the first one of the Beatitudes. And poor in spirit he's using this in the sense of sense one who is nothing, who has nothing, one ultimately, to go to the point, one whose ego has been reduced. You might say one who's not beaten down, but one who is not guided by ego consciousness, one who has no sense of attachment, no sense of I. To be poor in spirit, to be completely without ego and without selfish desires, but utterly receptive to God's will. That sense of I has been relinquished. And he was really speaking here, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, a union with God, in urging his disciples to accept the thought of their nothingness before God, in the sense that God is everything. And in a sense, this is the essence of the spiritual path. To the degree that the ego dominates, it's difficult for the soul to have a place in our life, daily life, in you might say outwardly speaking, or as they often said, like life is the spiritual path is a razor's edge. There's not room for ego and also soul consciousness. And so blessed are the poor in spirit. It's poor in spirit, those who have relinquished that little sense of little self, for theirs is the kingdom of the God, and spirit infuses us. And then you could say the beginning with this sets the tone for us. When we are poor in spirit in this sense, we're open and receptive to that which follows. And so he starts this way, to basically put thy ego aside and then be open, for then you will receive the kingdom of heaven. Then he goes and he says, second one, he says, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Now, we mourn. We mourn for what is mourning? Mourning comes for the loss. We mourn for material things. We have a sense of, oh, we lost this, we lost that, and separation. But but Jesus is speaking here. Why is one blessed? Is one blessed when one loses one's wealth? Well, you could say philosophically, maybe so in the long run, but do you feel blessed when you lose your wealth? No, you don't. So he was speaking, for they shall be comforted. Well, he's talking about it's essential for the spiritual devotee taking up. One, we put our ego aside, but that's not enough. We must mourn for something more, the absence of truth, the absence of God. When we have those missing from our life, there is naturally within the devotee arises an insatiable desire to make a great effort to contact God. And it takes time to come to that realization that what's missing? What's missing in life? Why? What is it going to take to make me happy? But when we become aware of our separation from God, there is a stage, which all devotees go through, where we mourn. We want something more, and it's an ache to the heart, and we need to. But then we think, I don't want this, but yet it's an essential state that we must go through, because it impels us to look for the answers. And here Jesus is saying, it's a blessed for those that mourn for God, mourn for truth, mourn for higher values in life. And it reassures us, for they shall be comforted. The very act of wanting God draws that answer out of the universe. And so you could say it's like the image of the story we often talk about, the naughty baby who cries continuously until it finally attracts the attention of the Divine Mother. Then, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, the word meek is, unfortunately, in modern language, it's taken on a bit of a negative connotation. You think, oh, somebody's meek, meek and mild. Somebody like that, very passive, passive meekness without strength. But it's not. Traditionally, if you go back in language, and that this translation which I'm reading, is a King James version, which is back from the time 16th century, 17th, 16th century, I think 15th, 16th, maybe 17th. And even then, Meek had a more stronger understanding of what that meant, is because meekness, you sort of say a person turns the other cheek, or, goes the extra mile, but not with strength. But meekness really, in its positive sense, implies that someone who's able to remain calm and subdued even when provoked. That's it. That's, you might say, its old traditional meaning, to be unprovoked by what happens to one, to be mild, and to be able to take the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune, as Shakespeare said. This is essential, that to one have that attitude, to be, in a sense, it applies that one is self-centered in the spiritual sense, and not affected outwardly by the ups and downs, the likes and dislikes that are inevitably a part of our existence. Jesus goes on to say, or you might say, as the way Swamiji defined this, is just to finish that one, is he said, blessed are those who live not aggressively or self-assertively, but in harmony with divine law. The world comes to them and supports them in return when one lives in harmony with law, with the divine law. The next one is, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, you could say that means blessed are they that hunger for truth, and they alone shall find fulfillment. And this is, of course, coming back to, again, those who are hungry. Now, you see translation, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. And people think of it in terms of outwardly, but thirst for righteousness. And again, what does righteousness mean? Those who, in the previous one, we said those who mourn because they don't have God, impelling one to seek God. But in the seeking of God, we also hear righteousness means the application of spiritual life into the world, into our daily lives, into our actions, that which we do. Dharma, in other words, live a dharma, those who hunger and thirst to live a dharmic life, applying this spirituality into our daily life. For they shall be filled. And we need to understand that he was saying it's not just for ourselves, but we need to then act in such a way. Many people want God, but when you actually try to apply that into one's daily life, which the implication is if you want God, you're going to have to change. You're going to have to do something. Oh, your enthusiasm wanes. But it's essential that we thirst and hunger for truth, you see, and then for the sake of righteousness, so that we can apply these into the life. So we ask the question, how can I find truth? We begin to seek and do what is needed. But then the next question is, okay, we thirst. How do I find truth? You might say is being asked here. And, in the sense, you could say we hunger for techniques, for salvation, the ways. How do I get out of this maze of confusion that I find myself in? And those that are thirsty and hungry will find that their thirst and hunger will be answered. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And what is mercy? Mercy is an expression of compassion. It's an expression of kindness, and compassion springs from a recognition that there is a bond between everybody. So, blessed are the merciful. To merciful are those who have transcended that sense of separation from others. In a sense, what is the basis of that? What comes from compassion is love, divine love. We recognize that bond. We're naturally inclined to be concerned for others, and more than just concern for ourselves. And we want to serve as an instrument. Because to be merciful, in a sense, also implies a certain amount of action, to be an instrument of divine grace, an instrument of love for those who are in need of that. So to have that compassionate attitude toward life, which is based, of course, upon seeing that we are one. We are, and in many ways, you can also make equivalencies between these and the yamas and the niyamas as well. We think of nonviolence and truly to perfect nonviolence, we have to see that how can I be not violent to others when that's an expression of myself? So to be an instrument for good is to be nonviolent, is to actually be an instrument of that bond that we feel. And so there's a real, the similar dispelling of the ego, which is implied earlier in the earlier beatitude, leads to this sense of bondage. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, I think that speaks for itself. Purity of heart, the removal of all those things that separate us. And isn't this what Swami Shri Yukteswar, what is implying? We must purify the heart. The first and essential step on the spiritual path is to remove those impurities. And it's the foundation of the spiritual path. And there's naturally what comes to us. What is the blessing? Blessed are the pure in heart. Why? They shall see God. Those things that separate us are removed. And the removal of those things, the likes and dislikes, all of those things that inform us or compel us to act from a sense of ego consciousness. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And Swamiji, he used this language, which I'll read. Blessed are they who live unshakably in the consciousness of inner peace, who emanate peace to everyone whose lives they touch. They shall be hailed as instruments of the Lord. And Master said, peace is the firstborn in the temple of silence. And what they're saying here is God comes to us as peace in meditation. Those who make peace within the temple of silence are the true children of God. There's another way to say this. And when a person feels a sense of peace within themselves, it's very natural to want to manifest that in our daily life. So when we meditate, when we feel these various aspects of the divine arising within us, peace usually being the very first one, it's natural. We feel it there in meditation. It's very natural then to want to take that out and manifest that in home, society, and in everything that we do. And this is what you might say, establishing righteousness in the world around us. And Master gave an example in his writing. He says, anyone who removes misunderstandings between other people, in a sense, is a peacemaker. Anyone who can transcend a sense of I and thy and a sense that we're all one family, they're establishing peace. And this, of course, is what's needed, not just in ourselves and our families, but also in society at large. And you could say the very opposite. Anybody who stirs up strife, who causes division, who has manifest jealousy and whatever to divide people, is the opposite of what a peacemaker is. And of course, to be the opposite, we naturally feel the results of that, which we feel sorrow. We feel suffering. And who wants to suffer? What's the answer to suffering? Become a peacemaker. Feel that peace in meditation, and then try to expand that peace that it fills our consciousness, and then try to be an instrument. Lord, make me an instrument of thy pleas. The next one is, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here, again, two ideas being expressed here. One, persecution. The other one, persecution for righteousness' sake. In other words, for wanting to do the right thing. Blessed are those who are persecuted for that. And unfortunately, this world is made in such a way that if you tried, there's that phrase, no good deed goes unpunished. I kind of like that because, you tried to do something good in life and you're going to find people criticizing you, misunderstandings, and there's a sense of jealousy, perhaps. People don't like others who, people who tend to be a little bit evil-minded or dark-minded, let's say. They don't like the light shining on them because what does it do? It just, that light that shines on them reveals their own darkness to themselves, and they don't like it. They don't feel comfortable. Now, a wise person, seeing that, because we see that sometimes, will go within and try to rectify that within themselves. But a person of lesser awareness, you might say, they project it outward. Get rid of the light and I will solve the problem. And that's not the way of wisdom, obviously. But unfortunately, that is the way of the world. And so you have to, you could say, expect that. It's no use getting angry about it or resentful about it or anything. It's unfortunate, certainly, but it's part of the world, just the way the world is, this eternal struggle between the light and the dark. And to stand up, he's saying here, blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake, those who are trying to do the right thing. And if they end up being persecuted for that, take it in the right spirit, because there's a blessing, just the attempt to do the right thing in the face of criticism, the face of opposition. You're strengthened by that, and you're blessed by that. There will come a blessing. You're in a sense, you're uplifted. And of course, Jesus's life was a testament to that very situation, where he ends up being crucified in the end. But you could sort of say, or is I think maybe it was Swami who said it, the bliss of God will visit those souls who let themselves undergo the torture of false criticism. And it's just part of the way this world is made. And of course, you could, if you took this, I think if you take this inwardly, apply it to ourselves on a, you might say a little bit deeper level, you could say that also means that those souls who are persecuted and tortured by temptation of the senses or by bad habits, resistance to those, because the outward criticism that we get, the outward difficulties that we find, we can understand that. But remember, this battle is going on within ourselves too. And you could say we're persecuted and tortured by the senses through temptation of the senses and bad habits. Resist those who resist for righteousness' sake, trying to do the right thing. This ultimately leads to defeat of the senses. And so Master or others have said, he says, don't feel bad if you're tempted, and just try to resist. And if you fail, you fail, but put out the effort. And that's what's asked. That's what's asked of the devotee, to at least try to resist rather than just giving in to whatever comes along that doesn't like what you're doing. And whether that's inwardly your own senses or perhaps outwardly, resist evil. You can't always win, but remember the reward ultimately is within your own self, that you'll be the ultimate gainer. It said, blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So here he basically sums that up. Remember all the great ones. Or as you could say, as Swamiji used to say, nothing great is ever gained in life without tapasya, without sacrifice, without a giving up outwardly, but really this is the giving up inwardly of our attachments, the giving up of our likes and our dislikes, the giving up of our pettiness. These are all sacrifices we have to make. And of course, the outward, you could say the outward manifestation of that is persecution, and Jesus here is using the example of the prophets that had gone before him. Because if you read the Old Testament of the Bible, which is basically the story of the rise and the evolution of the Jewish nation, there were a long succession of prophets, and more often than not, the prophets were rejected. The prophets were reviled. Some of them were stoned, and yet one after the next, they keep coming back to remind people. And so consequently, if you have something good to say, don't be surprised when people don't accept what you have to say. It's part of the territory. Don't feel right, self-righteous in the sense of, I must be right because look at how people are opposing me. Maybe you are wrong. And within yourself, your own conscience will sometimes revile you and persecute you for your own good, because you need to be reminded sometimes that we are on the wrong path. So if others revile you outwardly, take it in a good spirit, because we have to be tested, and truth needs to be tested. To just say something good and to expound upon philosophy doesn't make you a wise person, and it doesn't make you saintly, but it needs a little bit of testing in the fire of daily experience, testing in the fire of opposition in order to come to a deeper understanding. Is the path that I've taken up truly going to make a difference in my life? Is it really true? And the truth is tested within us, but the real proof of a test is the inner joy that comes, the inner peace that comes, the inner presence of, you might say, God's hand in working within us. And as Swami would often quote one of those Christian mystics who said, a sad saint is a sad saint indeed. So if you find yourself being upset and disappointed and you know, because people don't understand you, and it makes you bitter, makes you cynical, makes you sarcastic, and all of those negative reactions that are possible when you're opposed by good things, and or by when you say good things, try to do good things. Remember, take it in. It's, of course, we don't want to invite negativity, but it's just part of the world, and it's a part of testing. Look at it as karma, that you're being purified. You're being purified in. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to walk upon a bed of nails in order to strengthen yourself, but it's just you might say a realistic understanding that it's not a bed of roses that we're lying in. There are going to be thorns as well, but it's for our strength that purifies us. It's for our willingness to test our willingness to overcome the limitations of who and what, of the littleness of ego. And ultimately, when the ego is purified, when we purify the soul of the ego consciousness, we find the only thing left is bliss. And I remember Swami being that way in his latter part of his life, because he had gone through a lot of tests and trials in his life. And he didn't like them. He didn't like them to be there. And he was suffered because of them. But at the end of his life, he came to the understanding that it was all God's will. And the fact that he held on, as he said, Master, you may reject me, but I will never let you go. And he said he just felt such bliss in everything and he said, remember, whatever trials you go through in daily life to live the spiritual life, it's worth it in the end. And he felt the only way you'll ever understand that is to walk your own path toward truth. And he says, there's no saint that has ever lived, that has gone through their life of tests and trials and to come out the other end, who has disavowed that truth. It's worth it in the end. And you could say life's journey is to realize that, to come to a state of joy. And through practice of what the masters have given us, of all the great saints throughout tradition have given us, if we can learn to live for righteousness' sake, these truths in our daily life, we see that we ultimately are the blessed. We're blessed. And this, Jesus says in these Beatitudes, blessed art thou, for all of these various qualities that you manifest in your spiritual life. And so we don't really have time to ask questions this week or answer questions this week. As I said, I'll warn you that this week and next week, there's so much material, but I do want to come back, and I will come back in subsequent weeks to answer questions. So next week, I want to go into the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, and probably the week after that, we'll dedicate strictly for questions and answers and commentary, which I'd like to hear your thoughts as well and your experiences as well. So God bless all of you, and I wishing you appropriately a happy New Year, a blessed New Year. Blessed are those who live in the light of the Lord, and let's do that in the coming year. God bless all of you, and I'll see you next week. Joy to you.